The glass of wine in my hand was shaking before I even understood why. I was standing at the edge of a room filled with creatures who were not human, holding a drink I had not asked for, wearing a uniform that did not belong to me. My name is Daniel Hartley, and 3 hours earlier I had been checking microphone cables under a stage. Now every eye in the grand hall of Ceres Station was locked on me, and I had no idea what I had done wrong. It started as a normal night. The first official trade summit between Earth and the Veil Compact was supposed to be simple. Humanity had just been invited to sit at the table with older, more powerful star nations, and my job was small. I translated documents, I fixed broken equipment, I carried coffee to people who mattered far more than I did. Nobody in that hall knew my name, and that was exactly how I liked it. The Veil Compact was not one species but many, bound together under a royal family that had ruled for longer than human civilization had existed. Their ships were larger than our moon bases. Their language had 4 tenses for the past and none for uncertainty, because uncertainty was something they had engineered out of their culture centuries ago. Every movement in that hall was planned, every smile was calculated, every word was chosen like a piece on a game board. Except for hers. Princess Sereth sat at the high table beside her parents, King Vorlon and Queen Illyra, rulers of the Veil throne. She wore robes made of a fabric that shifted color when she moved, and her skin held a faint silver shimmer under the hall lights. She was, by every account I had heard, the most important unmarried person in 3 star systems. Ambassadors had spent decades trying to arrange a match with her. Kings had gone to war over lesser prizes. I had been told, very clearly, not to look directly at her. It was considered disrespectful for someone of my rank to hold her gaze for more than a second. So when I felt her eyes on me from across the hall, I did what any sensible person would do. I looked away. She did not. I felt it again a moment later, sharper this time, like a physical touch. I glanced up just long enough to see her staring straight at me, ignoring the ambassador speaking beside her, ignoring her own mother's hand on her arm. Her eyes were a pale gold, almost bright enough to glow, and they did not move. I told myself I was imagining things. Important people did not look at people like me. I turned back to Laura Bennett, my colleague from the human delegation, who was refilling her glass beside me. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said. "I think the princess is staring at me." Laura laughed, not unkindly. "Sure, Daniel, and I'm secretly the Queen of England." I laughed too, because it was easier than believing what I had just seen. The dinner continued. Speeches were given about friendship between our peoples, about trade routes and shared futures. I stopped watching the high table. I told myself the moment had passed. Then the music stopped. Not slowed, not faded. Stopped, all at once, the way a held breath stops. I looked up and saw every Veil attendant in the room frozen mid-motion, staring at the same point I was now staring at. Princess Sereth had stood up. She had not asked permission. She had not waited for a pause in conversation. She simply rose from her chair, robes shifting from deep blue to a burning gold, and the entire hall fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Her mother reached for her arm again. Sereth stepped away without looking at her. She raised one hand, slender fingers extended, and pointed directly across the room, at me. For one full second, I genuinely believed she was pointing at someone standing near me. I actually turned to look behind myself, hoping to see some important diplomat I had not noticed. There was no one there. When I turned back, she had not moved. Her arm was steady. Her eyes had not left mine. "I want him," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried through the hall like a blade cutting silk. She said it in Veil first, a phrase I recognized instantly from months of translation work, a phrase that carried far more legal weight than its simple words suggested. Then, as if to remove any possible doubt, she said it again in flawless English, clearly, deliberately, for every human in the room to understand without question. "I want him." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the hall broke apart into chaos. King Vorlon rose so fast his chair scraped backward across the floor with a sound like a scream. Queen Alira's face had gone the color of old ash, her mouth open but no words coming out. Vale nobles at nearby tables began speaking rapidly to one another in low, urgent voices, several of them turning to stare at me with expressions I could not read, though none of them looked friendly. On the human side of the hall, Ambassador Nathan Pierce, our head of delegation, had gone stiff as a board, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. Beside me, Laura had stopped breathing entirely. "Daniel," she whispered, "what did you do?" "Nothing," I said, and I meant it completely. I have never spoken to her. I have never even been in the same room as her before tonight. Then why is she pointing at you like that? I did not have an answer. I did not have any answer at all. Sereth began walking. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the calm, unhurried steps of someone who believed the entire room would simply part around her, which it did. Vale attendants pressed themselves back against the walls. Guards in ceremonial armor stepped forward, then stopped, uncertain, glancing toward the king for instruction that did not come fast enough. She crossed the length of that enormous hall while every single person in it watched her walk toward me, and I stood frozen, holding a glass of wine I had completely forgotten I was still holding, my mind racing through every possible explanation and finding none of them believable. She stopped less than an arm's length away from me. Up close, her eyes were even brighter than I had realized, flecked with threads of deeper gold near the center, and there was something in them that did not match the calm confidence of her posture. Something closer to fear, carefully hidden beneath layers of practiced composure. "Do you know what you just did to me?" I said quietly, before I could stop myself. It was not the polite phrase I had been trained to use in the presence of Vale royalty. It came out raw, honest, a little desperate. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Yes," she said, "I know exactly what I did." Behind her, King Vorlon's voice cut through the hall, sharp with a fury I had never heard from any recording of him. "Sereth, return to the table, now." She did not turn around. "I have made my declaration, Father, before witnesses. It cannot be undone." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. I did not fully understand their legal meaning yet, not in that moment, but I understood the reaction around me well enough. Nobles were whispering the word Shakai to one another, over and over, their faces pale with something between shock and outrage. I had translated that word before. In old diplomatic texts, nobody expected to matter anymore. A binding declaration, spoken before witnesses, impossible to withdraw once made. I looked at Sereth, and for the first time I saw past the robes and the golden eyes, and the weight of an empire sitting on her shoulders. I saw someone who had just done something enormous, something irreversible, and who was standing very still because she knew there was no walking it back. "Why me?" I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know my name." "Daniel Hartley," she said, and hearing my own name in her mouth sent a strange, cold shock through my chest. "I know exactly who you are. I have known for 3 days." Before I could ask what that meant, guards finally moved, not toward me, but toward her, forming a loose barrier meant to guide her back to the royal table. She allowed herself to be led away, but she looked back once, directly at me, and something in that look told me this was not over, not even close. Ambassador Pierce grabbed my arm the moment she was out of earshot, his grip tight enough to hurt. "What did you do?" he hissed. "Nothing," I said again, because it was still the only true answer I had. "I swear to you, I have never spoken a single word to her before tonight." Laura's hand found my shoulder, steadying me, though I was not sure either of us believed it was working. Around the hall, Vale nobles were already breaking into small, urgent clusters, whispering behind raised hands, throwing glances my way that ranged from disbelief to something sharper, colder, closer to hostility. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake in the small quarters assigned to junior staff, replaying the moment over and over, trying to find some explanation that made sense. A misunderstanding, a translation error, a cruel joke played by nobles who found humans amusing. Anything except the truth, which was slowly forcing its way into my mind, no matter how hard I tried to push it back. She had meant it, every word. And somewhere above the station, in rooms far grander than mine, a king and queen who had ruled a galactic power for longer than my entire species had walked upright, were now facing a problem they had never expected. Their daughter, heir to one of the oldest thrones among the stars, had just declared, in front of every important person in 3 systems, that she wanted a nobody, a translator, a cable technician, me. I did not know yet that Vale law considered such a declaration permanent. I did not know that refusing it, for either of us, carried consequences neither side would easily survive politically. I only knew, lying there in the dark, staring at a ceiling that suddenly felt too close, that my quiet, unnoticed life had ended the moment she raised her hand and pointed across that hall. Whatever came next, there was no version of my future that looked anything like my past. By morning, the entire station knew my name. I found this out the hard way, when I stepped out of my quarters and 2 Vale guards in dark ceremonial plating fell into step beside me without a word of explanation. They did not answer my questions. They simply walked, one on each side, escorting me down a corridor I did not recognize, toward a set of doors carved from a stone so dark it seemed to swallow the light around it. Inside was a private council chamber, and it was already full of people who wanted answers I did not have. Lord Kryn stood at the head of a long table, a tall Vale noble with sharp features and eyes the color of frozen water. I recognized him from briefing documents. He was a senior member of the royal court, distantly related to the king, and known for opposing any expansion of Vale influence toward newer species like humanity. He looked at me the way someone looks at an insect that has wandered somewhere it does not belong. "Explain yourself," he said, without any greeting at all. "Explain what, exactly?" I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I did not ask for any of this. "The Princess of the Vale Compact does not simply choose a stranger at random," Kryn said, circling the table slowly. "There must have been contact, communication, some arrangement made before last night." "There was none," I said. "I had never seen her in person before that hall. I have translated documents that mentioned her. I have never spoken to her." Several of the nobles exchanged glances that told me clearly they did not believe a word of it. One of them, an older woman with silver markings along her jaw, leaned forward. "Perhaps you used some human method, some technology, a signal she could not resist." I almost laughed, though nothing about the situation was funny. "I fix broken microphones," I said. "I am not capable of manipulating the mind of a woman I have never met." Lord Kryn studied me for a long moment, clearly searching for a lie he could not find, because there was none to find. Finally he waved a hand toward the guards. "Bring her in. Let her explain what her father and I cannot." The doors opened again, and Sareth walked in, flanked by 2 attendants who peeled away the moment she crossed the threshold, leaving her standing alone near the center of the room. She had changed out of her ceremonial robes into something simpler, dark fabric that moved less dramatically, though her presence still commanded the room the way it had the night before. "You have caused a disruption that threatens generations of careful alliance building," Kryn said to her, his voice sharp with restrained anger. "Explain your reasoning, Princess, or I will have no choice but to bring this matter before the full council." Sareth did not flinch. "I have made a lawful declaration. There is nothing to explain." "There is everything to explain," Kryn snapped. "You have chosen an outsider with no rank, no fortune, no political standing whatsoever, a common laborer from a species barely a century into space travel. This is not a match. This is an insult to the throne." Something in her expression hardened at that, though she kept her voice level. "I have watched this court arrange matches for me since I was old enough to understand what marriage meant. Every suitor brought before me came with a ledger instead of a heart. Every proposal was measured in trade routes and military support and territory. I have been asked, more times than I can count, to smile at men and women who saw nothing in me except the crown on my head. She turned, finally, and looked at me directly for the first time since entering the room. "He has nothing to gain from me," she said. "No fortune, no alliance, no territory." He did not know my name until I said his in front of the entire court. For the first time in my life, someone might actually want me, instead of what I represent. The room went quiet. Even Lord Kryn seemed momentarily caught off guard by the honesty of it, though his expression quickly hardened back into disapproval. "Sentiment," he said, "is not a foundation for succession. The throne cannot be built on a girl's loneliness." "Then perhaps the throne has built itself on something worse for far too long," Sereth said quietly, and even I could hear the years of frustration behind those words. I stood there, caught between two people arguing about my life as though I were a piece of evidence rather than a person, and finally I found my voice. "May I say something?" Every eye in the room turned toward me, most of them surprised that I had spoken at all. "I did not ask to be part of this," I said carefully. "I understand that my presence here creates a problem for your court. I have no interest in causing harm to anyone, or in claiming something I have not earned, but I also will not stand here and be spoken about as though I have no thoughts of my own on the matter." Lord Kryn's eyes narrowed. And what thoughts might those be? I looked at Sereth before I answered, and something in her expression, some quiet flicker of hope she was clearly trying to hide, made the decision easier than I expected. "I think if two people choose each other honestly, it should count for something, no matter where they come from. I do not know your laws well enough to say what happens next, but I am not afraid to find out." The room stayed silent for a long moment. Lord Kryn's jaw tightened, and I could see him searching for a way to dismiss what I had said, but nothing came. Finally, King Vorlon himself entered the chamber, and every noble present rose instantly, myself included, though I was slower to understand the protocol. He looked older up close than he had appeared across the banquet hall the night before, his silver hair pulled back in a style that seemed to carry its own quiet authority. Behind him walked Queen Alira, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes betraying real worry as they moved between her daughter and me. "This situation cannot simply be dismissed," the king said, his voice heavy with exhaustion rather than anger now. "Nor can it be quietly resolved. Word has already spread beyond this station. Half the systems in the compact will know of this by tomorrow." "Then let them know," Sereth said. "I will not retract my words." "You cannot retract them," Queen Alira said softly. "That is precisely the problem, my daughter. A Shakai declaration, once spoken before witnesses, is binding under our oldest laws. There is no version of tomorrow where this simply disappears." I felt my stomach tighten at the confirmation of what I had feared since translating that word in my head the night before. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not something that would fade quietly once tempers cooled. Whatever Serath had started, it was already locked into motion, and I was now standing directly inside it. "There is a path," Lord Kryn said slowly, though his tone made it clear he did not offer it out of kindness. "An old custom, rarely invoked in recent centuries, meant for situations exactly like this one. When an outsider is claimed by one of royal blood, that outsider may be required to prove themselves worthy through the HFY. Queen Alira's eyes widened slightly. "Kryn, that custom has not been used in generations. It was designed for a different age." "And yet it still exists in our law," Kryn said, a thin smile crossing his face, for the first time since I had entered the room. "If this human truly believes he deserves a place beside the princess, let him prove it the way our ancestors would have required. Let the trials decide what sentiment cannot." The king was quiet for a long moment, weighing something I could not fully understand, before he finally nodded. "So be it. If the human survives the HFY, the council will formally recognize the declaration. If he fails, or withdraws, the matter will be considered closed, and my daughter will be free to make a lawful match elsewhere." Sereth's eyes flashed toward me, and I saw the fear there again, sharper this time, no longer hidden beneath composure. "Father, he does not know our customs. He does not know what the trials demand." "Then he will learn quickly," Kryn said, satisfaction plain in his voice. "Or he will fail quickly. Either outcome resolves this matter." I felt every eye in the room turn to me again, waiting for my answer, and I understood in that moment that whatever came next was no longer a misunderstanding to be cleared up with words. It was a test, designed by people who very much wanted me to fail it. I looked at Sereth one more time. She gave the smallest shake of her head, a silent warning, a silent apology, both at once. I looked back at Lord Kryn instead. "Tell me what I need to do," I said, "and I will do it." Something like disappointment flickered across his face, as though he had expected fear instead of resolve, and for the first time since entering that chamber, I felt something other than confusion. I felt the faint, stubborn beginning of determination, the kind that had carried my species through every impossible challenge we had ever faced, long before we ever left our own small, quiet planet. Whatever the HFY turned out to be, I intended to walk out of it standing. The trials began 3 days later, in an arena carved into the lower levels of Seri Station, a place I had not even known existed until guards led me down flight after flight of stairs into a circular chamber ringed with stone seats older than any human structure on Earth. Laura walked beside me for as long as she was allowed, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, worry written across every line of her face. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, for at least the 5th time that morning. "I know," I said. "But I want to. You don't even know what the trials involve." "Neither do they, apparently," I said, trying for a joke that came out flatter than I intended. "Nobody's used this custom in generations. We're all finding out together." She did not laugh, but she squeezed my shoulder once before the guards separated us at the entrance to the arena floor. Lord Kryn stood waiting near a raised platform, along with a panel of elders I recognized from court records, ancient Vale nobles whose robes carried markings denoting centuries of accumulated rank. At the center of the arena floor stood a single figure I did not expect, a Vale warrior built like a wall, arms crossed, watching me with open, undisguised amusement. "The first trial is called Stenar," Kryn announced, his voice carrying easily across the stone chamber. "A test of endurance and strength, as our ancestors valued them. You will face our chosen champion in unarmed combat. The trial ends when one combatant yields, or can no longer continue." I looked at the warrior across from me, easily twice my size, and felt my stomach drop somewhere near my boots. This was clearly designed to end the entire matter in under a minute. "There a time limit?" I asked, mostly to buy myself a few extra seconds of thought. "There is not," Kryn said, something close to satisfaction in his voice. "The trial ends when it ends." I looked up into the stands, where Sereth sat beside her parents, her hands gripping the edge of her seat so tightly her knuckles had lost their color entirely. She caught my eye and mouthed something I could not quite make out, though I was fairly sure it was some version of "please be careful." The warrior did not wait for any formal signal. He simply moved. I threw myself sideways, more out of instinct than skill, and his fist connected with empty air where my head had been a half-second earlier. The crowd made a low sound of surprise, and I realized in that instant that nobody in this arena expected me to move at all. They expected me to stand still and absorb whatever came, the way Vale warriors trained to trade blows in straight lines, testing strength against strength. I had no strength worth testing. What I had was every dodgeball game from every gym class I had ever hated as a child, every instinct my small, unremarkable human body had developed over years of avoiding things bigger and faster than myself. He swung again, and I ducked under it, circling around behind him instead of standing to trade another blow. The crowd's murmur grew louder, confused now rather than amused. The warrior turned, clearly annoyed, and came at me again, more carefully this time. I let him close the distance, then dropped low and drove my shoulder into the side of his knee, not with enough force to seriously hurt him, but with exactly enough leverage to disrupt his balance. He staggered, arms windmilling, and before he could fully recover, I grabbed his extended arm and used his own forward momentum to pull him past me, sending him stumbling into the stone wall at the edge of the arena. The chamber went silent. He turned back toward me, more surprised than injured, blinking as though trying to understand what had just happened. I did not give him time to reset. I stayed low, moving constantly, refusing to stand still long enough to become the easy target his training had prepared him for. Every time he swung, I was somewhere else. Every time he tried to close distance, I redirected his own weight against him instead of meeting it head-on. It was not elegant. It was not, by any veil standard I later learned, considered honorable combat at all. But after several long minutes of this, the warrior stood breathing heavily, red-faced with frustration, while I remained standing, exhausted but unharmed. "Yield," Lord Kryn finally called out, his voice tight with something that was not quite anger, and not quite respect either. The warrior raised a hand grudgingly, and the trial ended. I looked up at the stands and found Sereth standing, both hands pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with something between shock and pride. Her mother sat beside her, expression unreadable, but her father was leaning forward, studying me with new and careful attention. The second trial came the following day, and it was not physical at all. I was led into a smaller chamber, this one arranged like a formal debate hall, where a rotating panel of Vale nobles asked me questions meant to test my understanding of politics, history, and diplomacy across the compact. This trial, called Veltha, was designed to determine whether an outsider possessed the intelligence and cultural knowledge necessary to stand beside royalty. I was, without question, at an enormous disadvantage. These nobles had studied their own history for centuries. I had studied it for a few months, mostly through documents I translated on breaks between other tasks. But I had one advantage none of them expected. I did not try to answer as though I already belonged in their world. I answered honestly, as an outsider looking in, and when I did not know something, I said so plainly instead of pretending otherwise. "You do not know the treaty terms of the Second Compact Accord," one elder said, her tone somewhere between disappointed and testing. "I do not," I admitted. "I know it ended a long conflict between three member worlds, but the specific terms were never part of my training. I would rather tell you the truth than guess and mislead you." Several of the elders exchanged glances at that, and I later learned that Vale nobles, trained from childhood to always project confidence regardless of actual knowledge, found genuine, unguarded honesty almost disarming in its rarity. Where I lacked information, I offered clear reasoning instead, walking them through how I would approach a problem even without complete facts, and more than once, an elder nodded slightly at an answer that was technically incomplete, but showed a mind working carefully rather than performing certainty it did not possess. By the end of the second trial, I had not impressed them with knowledge I did not have. I had impressed them, in spite of themselves, with the simple fact that I refused to pretend. The third trial nearly broke me, though not in the way anyone expected. Called Orvashi, it required me to spend 3 full days isolated in a small chamber, with no contact from anyone, including Sereth, meant to test whether an outsider's resolve could withstand solitude and doubt without the support of allies. I was given no explanation of what came after, no timeline, nothing except silence and my own thoughts. By the second day, doubt had crawled deep into my chest and refused to leave. I thought about Laura's warning. I thought about how easily this entire situation could end with me quietly returned to Earth, forgotten, a strange footnote in diplomatic history. I thought, more than once, about simply asking to withdraw. What kept me from doing it was not confidence. It was the memory of Sereth's face in that council chamber, admitting in front of hostile nobles that she had never once been chosen for herself. I thought about every ordinary person back home who had ever felt reduced to their usefulness instead of their worth, and I realized, sitting alone in that small stone room, that walking away now would prove every cynical assumption the Vale Court held about outsiders correct. So I stayed. Not because I was certain of anything, but because giving up felt worse than being afraid. When the chamber finally opened on the third day, I walked out steady on my feet, and Lord Kryn's expression, waiting just outside, told me clearly that he had expected otherwise. The final trial, however, was the one that nearly ended everything before it truly began. Called Dreshkai, it required a public debate before the full royal council, an open challenge where any noble present could question my worthiness directly, without restriction, in front of the entire court. Lord Kryn had clearly saved his sharpest arguments for this moment, and he did not waste time. Even if this human survives every physical and mental trial our customs demand, he announced to the assembled council, he remains, fundamentally, a member of a species barely capable of interstellar travel. What guarantee exists that humanity itself will not one day threaten the very throne he now seeks to join? Murmurs spread through the gathered nobles, and I felt the weight of centuries of suspicion pressing down on me all at once. This was no longer a question about my worth as an individual. It had become a question about my entire species, and I understood immediately that whatever I said next would matter far beyond myself. I stepped forward before fear could stop me. "You are right to be cautious," I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected in that vast chamber. Every new arrival to this galaxy could be a threat, until proven otherwise. But judging an entire people by what they might someday become, instead of what they actually are today, is the same mistake every civilization eventually makes about the ones who come after them. I looked directly at Lord Kryn as I continued. Humanity is young. We make mistakes. We argue among ourselves constantly, and we have not always treated each other with kindness. But we also do not give up easily, and we do not measure worth only in strategic value. If your daughter chose me, it was not because I offered your empire anything. It was because, for the first time, someone looked at her without calculating what she was worth to them first. The chamber fell into a heavy, uncertain silence, and for a long moment I genuinely did not know which way it would break. The council did not rule that day. Instead, King Vorlon rose and announced that the final judgment of the HFY would be delayed until a formal tribunal could be assembled, one that would include witnesses from both the Vale Compact and Earth's own delegation. What should have felt like a small mercy instead opened a door I had not anticipated, and through it walked people far more interested in using my situation than resolving it fairly. Ambassador Pierce found me the next morning in the quiet corridor outside my quarters, his expression carefully arranged into something meant to look like concern. "Daniel," he said, gripping my shoulder with a familiarity he had never shown before, "all of this began. You understand what an opportunity this represents." "An opportunity," I repeated flatly. "For Earth," he said, as though that explained everything. "If this marriage happens, humanity gains a direct blood connection to the Vale throne, trade concessions we could never negotiate otherwise, military support against threats we cannot yet face alone. You could secure more for our species in one union than a decade of treaties ever could." I stared at him, feeling something cold settle in my chest. "You want me to marry her for trade concessions?" "I want you to understand the stakes," Pierce said, his voice hardening slightly. "This is bigger than your personal feelings, Daniel. This is about the future of our entire species." "It is also about a person," I said. "Not a treaty. A person who deserves to be chosen for herself, not for what her marriage can extract from her family's empire." Pierce's jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw something almost like contempt flicker across his face. Sentiment is a luxury small species like ours cannot always afford. I walked away from him without answering, because I did not trust myself to respond calmly, and because I suspected he would simply repeat the argument regardless of what I said. It got worse before it got better. 2 days later, I learned that Pierce had already begun quiet negotiations with sympathetic members of Earth's Oversight Council, framing my situation as leverage in ongoing trade discussions with the Vale Compact. discussions that had nothing whatsoever to do with Sereth or myself. Word of these negotiations reached the Vale Court almost immediately, and Lord Kryn used it exactly as I feared he would. "You see now," he announced before the assembled elders, barely concealing his satisfaction, "precisely what I warned this council about. Humanity does not see this union as a matter of the heart. They see it as a bargaining chip, exactly as I predicted. This human sitting before you may claim sincerity, but his own delegation reveals the truth behind his species' intentions." I felt the ground shifting beneath me, the careful progress of the trials threatening to collapse under the weight of my own government's ambition, and I understood in that moment that winning this fight required more than surviving physical and mental tests. It required standing against my own side as firmly as I had stood against theirs. I requested, and was granted, a private audience with King Vorlon himself, a request that surprised nearly everyone, including me. He received me in a modest chamber, far smaller and less imposing than the grand council rooms I had grown used to, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, he looked at me not as a political problem, but simply as a person his daughter had chosen. "You wish to speak with me," he said, settling into a chair across from mine. "I did," I said. "I wanted you to hear directly from me that I have no part in what my own delegation is attempting. I did not ask them to use this situation for trade leverage, and I do not support it." "And yet your ambassador speaks for your entire species in these matters," the king said, though not unkindly. "How am I to separate your intentions from theirs?" "You cannot separate them through my words alone," I admitted. "You can only judge them through my actions. I intend to make it very clear, publicly if necessary, that I reject any attempt to turn Sereth, or myself, into a transaction." The king studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the way I imagined only someone who had ruled for decades could manage. "My daughter believes you see her clearly, Daniel Hartley. Perhaps for the first time in her life, someone does. I confess I did not expect that clarity from a member of your species, given everything I have witnessed of your delegation's behavior these past days." "My delegation does not speak for me," I said, "and I would ask that whatever judgment your council reaches, it be based on Sereth and myself, not on the ambitions of people who see us both as tools rather than as individuals." He nodded slowly, though he offered no promises, and I left that meeting uncertain whether I had helped my case or simply delayed its collapse. That evening, Sereth found me on one of the station's quiet observation decks, where a wide window looked out over the slow curve of the asteroid belt beyond. She had clearly heard about Pierce's negotiations and about my private meeting with her father, because she arrived already carrying the exhausted weight of someone who had spent the entire day defending our situation from every possible direction. "Your ambassador is trying to sell our marriage like cargo," she said without preamble, standing beside me at the window. "I know," I said. "I told your father I want no part of it." "I heard." She turned to look at me directly, her golden eyes catching the dim starlight from beyond the glass. "Lord Kryn is using it against us regardless. He tells the council that even if you are sincere, your entire species will simply use our union the moment it benefits them." "He might be right," I said honestly. "I cannot control what my government does. I can only control what I do." "Is that enough?" she asked quietly. "For either of us." I turned to face her fully, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the weight of everything happening around us pressing into the small, quiet space between our two lives. "I do not know if it is enough for your council," I said finally, "but it has to be enough for us, or none of the rest of it matters. If we let other people decide what this means, we lose it before we even have a chance to find out for ourselves." Something in her expression softened, the careful composure she wore like armor slipping just slightly. "My whole life, decisions about my future have been made in rooms I was not even invited into. I chose you because, for once, I wanted to make one decision entirely my own." "Then let's keep making it our own," I said. "Whatever happens with the tribunal, whatever my government tries to extract from this, or your council tries to prevent, that part stays ours." She reached out, hesitant at first, and took my hand in hers, her skin cool and unfamiliar and somehow exactly right. "There is still the matter of your ambassador," she said, a faint, tired smile touching her mouth. "He will not simply stop on his own." "No," I agreed, "he won't. So I intend to stop him myself." The following morning, I requested a formal statement be entered into the tribunal record, made publicly, in front of both delegations, refusing on record any trade concession, alliance benefit, or political advantage tied to my potential marriage to Serath. Ambassador Pierce was furious, cornering me afterward in a side chamber, his voice low and sharp with barely restrained anger. "Do you understand what you just threw away?" he demanded. "Do you understand what that could have meant for Earth?" "I understand exactly what I did," I said. "I made sure that whatever happens next happens because two people chose each other, not because our governments decided we were useful." "You had no right to make that decision unilaterally," Pierce snapped. "I had every right," I said. "It is my life being negotiated, not yours." He left without another word, and though I knew this would likely cost me any support from my own government going forward, I felt lighter than I had in days, as though I had finally stopped letting other people write the terms of my own story. Lord Kryn, when he learned of the public statement, seemed almost disappointed by how cleanly it removed one of his sharpest arguments, though he was far from finished. The tribunal date was set for 3 days later, and as it approached, I understood clearly that everything Serath and I had built through the trials, and everything I had just refused on principle, would finally be weighed together in front of the full council, human and Veil alike. Whatever judgment came next would not just decide our future. It would decide how an entire empire chose to see my entire species, for generations to come. The tribunal chamber was larger than any room I had stood in since arriving at Ceres Station, a vast circular hall ringed with tiered seating that rose so high the topmost rows disappeared into shadow above the lights. Every seat was filled. Veil nobles from across the compact had traveled for days to witness the judgment, along with representatives from Earth, journalists from both worlds, and elders whose robes carried markings so old I did not recognize half of them. I stood at the center of that hall, alone on a raised platform, with Serath standing on a matching platform a short distance away. Between us sat the full royal council, King Vorlon and Queen Alira at its head, flanked by Lord Kryn and a row of elders whose faces betrayed nothing of their intentions. "This tribunal convenes," announced the eldest of the council, a Veil woman named Thessa, whose voice carried the weight of centuries despite its quiet, measured tone, to render final judgment on the Shakai declaration made by Princess Serath before witnesses, and on the outcome of the Kathrai trials, undertaken by the human known as Daniel Hartley. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, quickly silenced by a raised hand from Elder Thessa. "The trials have been observed and recorded," she continued. "Stenar was survived. Veltha was answered with honesty rather than false confidence. Orvashi was endured without withdrawal. Dreshkai revealed conviction this council did not anticipate from an outsider. By the strict letter of our ancient law, the trials have been completed successfully." Hope flared in my chest for the first time in days, quickly tempered by the careful pause that followed her words. "And yet," Elder Thessa continued, "law alone does not always settle the deeper question before this council. Lord Kryn has raised concerns regarding the intentions of the human delegation as a whole, concerns not fully answered by one man's private conduct, however sincere it may be. Before this council renders final judgment, both parties will be given opportunity to speak." Lord Kryn rose first, exactly as I expected, his voice carrying easily through the enormous hall. "This council has watched a single human endure trials designed for individuals, and I do not dispute his personal resolve. But marriage into the royal line is never a matter of one person alone. It binds an entire species to our throne, our resources, our future. We have already seen how quickly Earth's own delegation attempted to exploit this union for gain, regardless of this man's personal refusal. What guarantee exists that future generations of humans will honor restraint this one man has shown when opportunity presents itself again? He turned toward me directly. Answer honestly, human. Can you promise, on behalf of your entire species, that no future leader of Earth will ever attempt to use this bond for advantage? The question landed heavily across the chamber, and I understood immediately that any promise I made on behalf of billions of people I did not represent would be hollow and easily disproven, so I did not make one. No, I said clearly, I cannot promise that. I cannot speak for every leader my species will ever produce, any more than you could promise me that no future Veil ruler will ever act selfishly or make a poor decision for personal gain. No civilization can offer that guarantee about itself, let alone about the entire span of its future. Kryn's eyes narrowed, clearly expecting a different, weaker answer. But, I continued, you did not ask this council to judge every possible future Veil ruler before allowing your current king to sit upon his throne. You judge each generation as it comes, by its own choices, not by fears about generations not yet born. Humanity is new to your galaxy. We are clumsy, sometimes selfish, sometimes short-sighted, exactly as every young civilization has been before us, including yours, many centuries ago, if your own histories are honest about it. A murmur spread through the gathered elders at that, and I saw Elder Thessa's expression shift slightly, something like careful consideration replacing neutral observation. You fear humanity might one day use this bond for advantage, I said, turning to address the full council rather than Kryn alone. I understand that fear, because I have watched my own delegation attempt exactly that this past week, and it disappointed me as much as it seems to concern you. But judging an entire species by its worst impulses, while ignoring its capacity for something better, is precisely the mistake this court accused Serath of making when she chose someone outside your usual calculations of political worth. I looked toward Serath as I continued, and something steadied in my chest at the sight of her watching me with quiet, unwavering attention. She was tired of being valued only for what she represented, rather than who she actually was. Humanity has arrived among the stars, carrying that same fear, worried that older, more powerful civilizations will only ever see us as resources to be measured, or threats to be contained, rather than people capable of choosing decency even when it costs us something. I turned back to face the full council directly. I cannot promise you my species will always choose well. No one could honestly promise that about any people, at any point in their history. What I can promise is this. Today, right now, standing before you, I choose Serath because of who she is, not because of what her throne can offer me, and I will continue making that choice for as long as she wants me to. If that is not enough for your law, then perhaps your law was never truly built to recognize something this simple in the first place. The chamber fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears, the same way I had on that very first night in the banquet hall, when Serath's declaration had first shattered the quiet, unnoticed life I used to have. Elder Thessa rose slowly from her seat, her ancient eyes moving between myself, Serath, and the assembled council members whose expressions ranged from uncertainty to something closer to reluctant respect. This council has judged many matters across many centuries, she said. Rarely has one been argued so plainly, without ornament, without the practiced elegance our own nobles are trained to display from childhood. Perhaps that plainness is itself worth consideration. She turned toward King Vorlon. Your Majesty, the law is satisfied by the completion of the trials. The remaining question is one of judgment, and judgment, ultimately, rests with the throne. King Vorlon rose slowly, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath at once. He looked first at Lord Kryn, whose expression had grown tight with tension, and then at his daughter, whose composure had finally cracked just enough to reveal the hope she had been carefully hiding since this entire ordeal began. I have ruled this throne for many years, he said, his voice heavy but steady. In that time, I have watched countless matches arranged for political advantage, for territory, for alliances, measured carefully in ledgers and treaties. I have watched my daughter endure suitor after suitor, who saw her crown before they ever saw her face." He paused, looking directly at me now. I did not expect an outsider from a species so young to be the one who finally saw her clearly. I do not know what the future holds for Earth, or for the choices your leaders will make in the centuries ahead. No one standing in this hall can know that with certainty, human or Veil alike. He turned back toward the full council. But I know what I witnessed in that banquet hall, and in every trial since. A man with nothing to gain, choosing to stay regardless. That is not something our law was designed to measure, and yet I believe it is exactly what our law was always meant to protect. He raised one hand, and the entire chamber seemed to lean forward as one. By the authority of this throne, the Shakai Declaration of Princess Serath is recognized as lawful and binding. The Kaithrai has been completed successfully. This matter is settled. The hall erupted, not into chaos this time, but into a rising wave of voices, some celebratory, some still murmuring uncertainty, but none of them able to overturn what had just been decided. Lord Kryn remained seated, his expression unreadable, though he did not rise to object further. Whatever battle remained between us, it would not be fought today. Serath crossed the distance between our platforms before I fully registered she had moved, and when she reached me, she did not speak first. She simply took my hand in both of hers, holding it the way someone holds something they were not entirely certain they would be allowed to keep. "You did not have to say all of that," she said quietly, beneath the noise of the crowd around us. "Yes, I did," I said. Every word of it was true. She smiled then, fully, without the careful composure she usually wore in public, and for a moment it felt as though the enormous chamber around us simply disappeared, leaving only the two of us standing in the space we had fought so hard to claim. News of the tribunal's judgment spread across both Earth and the Veil Compact within hours, and I will not pretend the road ahead became simple overnight. Ambassador Pierce was quietly recalled by Earth's Oversight Council within the month, his attempt to weaponize our union having embarrassed our entire delegation in front of an audience of watching star nations. Lord Kryn remained a political rival for years afterward, though even he eventually admitted, in private conversations I was not meant to overhear, that the trials had been completed fairly, whatever his personal feelings about the outcome. What mattered more, in the end, was smaller and quieter than any of the politics surrounding us. It was Serath choosing to walk beside me through station corridors without guards clearing a path ahead of her, simply because she wanted to. It was learning, slowly, how to exist as two people from entirely different worlds building something neither species had fully written rules for yet. It was watching, over the following months, as other Veil nobles began quietly reconsidering assumptions about humanity they had carried since our first contact, not because of any treaty or trade agreement, but because of one very public, very stubborn refusal to be reduced to a transaction. I never expected to matter to anyone beyond the narrow circle of people who knew my name before that night in the banquet hall. I certainly never expected an alien princess to point across a crowded room and change the entire course of my life with 3 simple words. But sometimes the biggest changes in history do not begin with armies, or treaties, or grand strategic plans. Sometimes they begin with someone simply refusing to be invisible any longer, and someone else finally choosing to see them. Serath once told me, months after the tribunal, that she had watched me for 3 days before that banquet, not because of anything remarkable I had done, but because I had been the only person in that entire station who never once looked at her like she was a prize to be won. I had simply treated her, in the few passing moments our paths had crossed, like a person. It turned out that was the rarest thing in the galaxy after all.